Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm thrilled to welcome Josh Rothkopf to the podcast today to talk about a big one, Dirty Harry, starring Clint Eastwood, released 50 years ago in December of 1971. How are we doing, Josh?
Hey, thanks for inviting me, Brian. I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks so much for being here. We've been talking Clint Eastwood a lot this year. We talked about The Beguiled last April and then Play Misty for Me in October. Now he has Dirty Harry in December. Quite a year for this guy, wouldn't you say?
This was definitely the year when Clint kind of arrived in a bigger way than he ever had been, right? As an American action star. And you could even argue that Dirty Harry is maybe his signature role. Mm-hmm. So this was definitely his arrival to that kind of A-list.
Yeah, it's such a cool year because in The Beguiled, he plays a darker character. We hadn't really seen that before. And then, of course, we also know Clint Eastwood as a great director, and Play Misty for Me is his first film as director. Right. So he was busy this year.
this would kind of be like if Arnold Schwarzenegger in 1984 made The Terminator and also made, I don't know, like some weird art film and then directed a third film himself. Right? So like Clint we've made a habit over decades at this point of underestimating how smart he is and how wide varied his talents are. And so, you're right. Absolutely. 50 years ago, right from the top, he's doing all three things. He's acting in blockbuster type movies before blockbuster type movies were really a thing. He's also acting in indie movies before that word is really used, indie, and he's directing movies. And so, I love that. I love that about him.
Yeah. So it's a really cool year. I'm really happy to kind of end the year talking Dirty Harry, probably one of the most famous movies of 1971. Before we get to our movie today, Josh, I'd love for you to just talk about kind of what role has film played in your life. And if you have a few favorites you could share with us, that would be great.
Oh, absolutely. It's such an interesting question, too, I'm thinking, because film has proven to be a great source of nourishment for me for so long. And I know people who have careers in other fields, and it's not quite the same, but right, the curiosity that you can maintain about cinema and about watching. I always dream about every movie that I start is going to be some kind of a brilliant masterpiece. And I always have that hope going into a movie, right? And so I feel very fortunate to have been able to have a livelihood in something that I love so much. When I started, I originally wanted to be a filmmaker, and I really got into movies in high school. And I started doing the work. I'm going to date myself here, but I started doing the work of, you would go to video stores and you would have to find video stores that had foreign film sections. And this was all on VHS. You buy a Laserdisc player so you can watch something in widescreen and flip it like a turntable, like piece of vinyl. And it was really the Wild West. And I remember a very formative screening for me was I went to SUNY. I was growing up on Long Island, and I drove up to SUNY Purchase for a live screening with an orchestra, an 80-piece orchestra of Charlie Chaplin's City Lights.
Oh, cool.
And I remember sitting there, right, in the balcony and seeing this gigantic image unspooling with the orchestra playing a score that Charlie Chaplin had written himself. He's acting in the film, he's directing the film, he's writing the film, he's editing the film. And I just was overwhelmed by the creative potential of what film could be. And if you ever do a special film on 100, episode in 2031, please invite me back to do City Lights, because that was an extraordinary, kind of a mind-altering experience for me. And I was bit by the film bug hard. When I was in college, I got into, genre stuff. I think like most people around that age did. I programmed the film series at Oberlin College, which is where I went. And I got a minor in film studies, and I learned. And then I also wrote a thesis when I was in college, an honors thesis about Sergio Leone and the spaghetti westerns and the post-modernity of them. Basically, the whole idea of Italians making Westerns and what the Old West really meant. It doesn't really have a literal meaning. It's more of a feeling. And so when you have Italians who have a completely different political history, a social history, commenting on the American West during the era of Vietnam, it became a very fascinating, loaded subject, and I really got into it. And that obviously includes movies like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and For a Few Dollars More. And I really, at that point in my life, really connected with Clint Eastwood and connected with spaghetti westerns. I've always loved Italian cinema. I've always loved horror films. A film that I think about in terms of my own real love of cinema, something that I return to often, is Chinatown. I feel like that's the perfect Hollywood film, probably the apotheosis of what Hollywood can do, both in terms of the craft and Polanski being a genius, but also in terms of the political ambition, the idea of trying to unpack a city's history and a whole kind of a subtext of malfeasance and exploitation and manipulation, and pack that into a mainstream entertainment with big stars, make the whole thing sound and look gorgeous, and then it wins Oscars. I should be specific. It won an Oscar for its screen by Robert Towne, but it was nominated for, I think, over 10. But
yeah, all the big ones.
all the big ones. And so I feel like Chinatown is as a screenwriter myself, I wanted to learn about what made a good film, and that was a real touchstone for me. And then I went to film school after college. I got a master's at Columbia College in Chicago, and I made a bunch of mediocre films. I think that I had this dream that I was going to be a filmmaker, and I loved scoring and composition, and I gravitated towards artists like Fellini and Nita Rota and Ennio Morricone. And then while I was in film school, to make ends meet, I started freelance writing for an alternative weekly called the Chicago Reader.
Okay.
Right. And I was second stringing and third stringing at the time for a critic who was very revered, Jonathan Rosenbaum, in Chicago. And he would basically not want to review certain films, and he would give them to the secondary staff or the freelancers. And I started reviewing movies. I learned the craft of how to write a review, how to write brief and to the point, how to really get to what you're saying. I remember this fascinating exchange I had with one of the copy editors at the Reader, where I was putting way too much plot in my reviews, and she's like, "Have a look at Jonathan Rosenbaum's review of AI. Look at it right now." And I read it, and she's like, "What did you notice about it?" And I said, "I don't know. What are you referring to?" She says, "Notice how he gets the entire plot in one sentence, and he talked about how it's about a robot boy in the future, and that's it. And the whole rest of the review was his ideas about it." And she said, if a movie is being marketed, if it's being saturated in media, if people know generally what it's about, you don't have to further that work. All you are responsible for when you're a critic is serving your own opinion. You're not serving the studio. You're not serving a distributor. You're not serving a potential Oscar campaign. You're serving your own response to art. And I took that to heart as advice. And by the end of my film school tenure, I was a regular reporter and reviewer, to the point where I had professors saying, "Hey, could you put me in touch with your editor so I could do some writing for the Reader?" I started writing for, and it's like nationwide. There are all weeklies. I wish this were still the case. It's so hard to break into freelancing.
Yeah.
But this was in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, and there were people there were as an editor in Nashville, and there was an editor in Minneapolis, and there were publications in New York, all over, where I could do a gig here, do a gig there, and then one thing leads to another, and I'm invited to Sundance to cover it for the Village Voice. And at that Sundance in 2004, I interviewed for the job at Time Out New York, which I ended up getting. So this is awesome. Wow. I'm sorry, I just went on. So just to finalize things, I ended up if you are like, if you have, let me put it this way, if you go to film school and you rack up massive student loan debt, and you basically put yourself in a situation where you have to get a job as critic. That's like basically entering into the lottery and needing to win. That's like buying a lottery ticket and needing to win the lottery. And so if you actually get a job that is like about reviewing, you have to go to it. So I moved from Chicago to New York, which is where I wanted to be. I ended up staying at Time Out New York for about 15 years, which is a
Wow. Okay.
long time. Most of my 30s and a large part of my 40s, was there. And it was really only because the magazine had a change in its business strategy, as happens. And I was laid off, like a lot of people, right at the start of the pandemic. And for the last 2 years, my only job was to sort of stay healthy and watch Mayor of Easttown, and I did those things very well, right? And then when things opened up again, I started looking for work, and again, very humbling and honored to be able to say this, but EW, approached me and I had some people who were vouching for me, and I interviewed with them and did an edit test, and now here I am. So now I am the senior movies editor at Entertainment Weekly.
Fantastic. How long have you been at Entertainment Weekly now?
It's been about, I guess, 6 weeks, 7 weeks. So I started at the end of September. And as you know, I've also been moving cross country from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. So I really don't advise doing both. And also you have to do a job virtually. So everything's on Zoom like this. And then also moving, my wife and I packed everything up, and I'm finally here in our new LA apartment. And it's nice because it's like a new chapter, and I'm grateful that life has brought this to me at this point in the road. The fact that I can continue to use my experience, and I love editing writers. I love writing myself. I love bringing the enthusiasm that you have for movies and art in general to a readership that wants to hear that. I believe in that. I think that there's a foundational core belief here that sort of guided me throughout my entire career, which is that if you're writing about movies, it should be fun.
Yes.
Movies are fun. And if you get the opportunity and the privilege to, like you're doing, do a podcast about movies or write about movies, you should be channeling your own enthusiasm, and you should be bringing people into that enthusiasm. Even if you are negative on a movie, or if you're not crazy about it or mixed on it, you have to bring people into your enthusiasm and your excitement. And I mean, this isn't plumbing, this isn't bricklaying. And I'm sure that there are people who do those things that are very enthusiastic about it, and God bless them. But we have this real exclusive and privileged position to talk about movies, and it should be stylish and fun. And so that's always been my guiding principle in all the writing, and all the people I've had the privilege to collaborate with and work with over the years. They've all been the A team, and I've really learned from them and grown from them. So
that's so interesting. That's so interesting you say that, because it's true. When you sit down to write a review or start a recording of a podcast, you want to have that fun, that enthusiasm, even if the movie's not great. I've watched some for this podcast that were just like so. They weren't terrible. They weren't that good. And it's like, man, how do I make this interesting? But you have to bring that enthusiasm for the craft, for the medium, even if you're talking about something that's not maybe at the top level.
And I think that you do that very well. And also the whole format of your podcast makes perfect sense in terms of channeling that enthusiasm, because you're talking about the films from 50 years ago that have really made a sizable impact. And we've had 50 years to appreciate and argue about the status of these films, and some of them have gained in status over the years, some have dipped in status over the years. But I'm so thrilled that we're talking about one today that in a lot of ways remains just as provocative as it was when it came out.
Yeah, really interesting. So let's get into Dirty Harry, Josh. Like, what are your memories of this movie? Like, when did you first see it? When you were younger? Like, what role has this movie played in your life?
Well, again, I'm going to date myself, but I was part of that generation, Gen X, proudly. That I mean, Dirty Harry was a dad movie. So
Yeah.
when I was a little boy,
Hmm.
or even like in junior high school, we were quoting Dirty Harry, but we hadn't seen it. I mean, come on, it's like I don't trust people who say, "Oh yeah, I saw Jaws when I was 4" or whatever. It's kind of like, what do you glean from it at that age? Like, what are we? I mean, when I was a little boy, we were running around high school and talking about a little boy. When I was younger, we were quoting Dirty Harry, probably without having seen it. We were saying, "Do you feel lucky, punk?"
Yep.
That was something that
Misquote.
we did. That was something that like, and so it had entered into the culture in such a profound way. But I think that I didn't really see the movie until at the earliest high school or maybe
Okay.
even college, and at that point I was pretty wowed by it. But I also feel like my reaction to it probably can't have been the same as as the people who saw it in 1971,
Mm.
because if you're a child of the 80s like I was, you you are already seeing films that come in the wake of Dirty Harry and are
Hmm.
profoundly influenced by it. The whole idea of the vigilante cop, or the
Hmm.
vigilante, I mean, and that goes, and there were all sorts of imitators that came after Dirty Harry, movies like Death Wish, and even a
Hmm.
lot of the Cameron stuff in the 80s that what became favorites of mine when I was growing up is, I think, strongly influenced if you by Dirty Harry. If you
Oh,
watch
right.
something
Hmm.
like a John Carpenter film, which also has a similar libertarian streak, and John Carpenter is a god to me.
One of my favorites. Yep.
Right, exactly. You're seeing a filmmaker who is, influenced by Don Siegel and the
Mm.
whole idea of the outsider who's trying to fix something that's wrong.
Yeah.
And
They
but in
live. Yeah. Hmm.
They Live is a perfect example and one of my favorites. Whereas in 1971, if you're talking about 1971 in San Francisco, you're talking about the counterculture, and you're
Hmm.
talking about the rights of people being trampled on by a, a sometimes fascist police force,
Hmm.
and you had a mayor who was assassinated, and I mean,
Hmm.
if you're talking about San Francisco in the 70s and 60s and 70s, it is ground zero for the fight between the left wing and the right wing,
Hmm.
and it's a fascinating dynamic into which Dirty Harry arrives. And this
Hmm.
is what a lot of the reviews at the time were talking about how, this is an irresponsible
Hmm.
cop who is going too far. And that is actually baked into the script itself. So it would basically be like if we had an action movie now that was about Black Lives Matter.
Mm.
Like, try to
Hmm.
imagine that. Like right now, something comes out and it is about, I don't know, it engages specifically about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter,
Hmm.
and takes a very provocative position, and then invites us as audiences to discuss it. I love that idea. I love the idea of a film coming along and saying, you can think about movies in a wider way than are you entertained. You can think about movies in a
Right.
larger dimension than, yeah, I enjoyed that. I had some popcorn and it was entertaining.
Had
This
some
is
candy in
not,
the dark.
yeah, it's right. This isn't empty calories. This is a movie about serious ideas. And you had critics calling it fascist. You had critics, prominent critics who hated it, prominent critics who loved it.
Hmm. Yeah, it was really interesting to see kind of what the response was in 71. It had a lot of controversy. I mean, there were people like outside the auditorium at the Oscars for 72 with like like
Yeah,
signs,
I heard about that, right?
screaming about this horrible movie, Dirty Harry. It's like, what?
Yeah, and also I if I and I don't I want to make sure I'm correct here, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of the protesting had to do with was protesting by feminists, which
Mm,
another layer that we haven't even touched on yet, which is the
yeah,
fact that, and their sign said things like "Dirty Harry's a pig,"
yeah.
and not just a pig in a sort of pejorative like cops are pigs, but also like, this is a movie that basically pressed everyone's button. If you were a libertarian, or if you were left wing,
Hmm.
it definitely riled you. If you're a woman, I mean, there are scenes in the film where we see Dirty Harry's kind of like a peeping Tom, or perceived as one.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of crossing the line in this movie,
Hmm.
and yeah, the response was inflammatory is a mild way of putting it.
Yeah. What's so interesting to me is it's such a great film. This is 2 months after The French Connection. That came out in October of 71. Also about a cop, also has some similarities, right? And the fact that French Connection wins Best Picture, Director, Actor, the Oscars, Dirty Harry isn't even nominated. Kind of interesting because I think French Connection is the better film, but I think Dirty Harry is up there. And it's kind of interesting to me. It's like, do they see it more as a genre film and exercise and action, Dirty Harry? Or it's like, why is this one kind of pushed aside when it comes to those major awards?
I think that that's a fascinating observation. That's very perceptive because I think Clint Eastwood is coming out of the Westerns.
Mm-hmm.
He's coming out of Bonanza and then the Sergio Leone stuff, which was very popular at the time. And so maybe it was a bucket that he was already put in, this idea that his police film would be an action film, whereas is something that was made by William Friedkin, who had maybe more of a pedigreed background, was classier. But I really do think that both films are engaging with this subject matter we're talking about, this idea of crossing the line and going too far. And actually, we can widen this out even and talk about that last quarter of 1971. You have movies like A Clockwork Orange, what, there was another one I was just thinking about. Straw Dogs, Peckinpah.
Straw Dogs. We just talked about that recently.
Right.
That is
Right.
quite a film.
So imagine one fall and winter in which these movies all come out, and all of them expressly about the role of violence in society, and how far is too far, and what are the responsibilities that we have to each other as members of a society and a civilization, to follow the law or not follow the law. Do we have a responsibility to break the law when justice requires it of us? The idea that our cinema, our popular cinema, these aren't even art films, these are mainstream films made by studios. Our cinema is engaging with the most important subject of any civilization, which is the conduct of civilians and the rule of law. I think that that's amazing to think that a mainstream cinema could do that, and our cinema could do that too. But you really have to imagine one in which 4 movies like Judas and the Black Messiah are made and released within a 3-month period. Like, I'd love to see that happen, but we're not quite there.
I'm just trying to picture that audience member like in December of 71, and they're like, so what do we want to see tonight? Straw Dogs, Clockwork Orange, or Dirty Harry? Or how about Polanski's Macbeth? That's another one.
Right, exactly.
It's like
again, right, exactly. Polanski's Macbeth, which comes out obviously in the wake of the Manson murders, and the whole idea of guilt and ambition. Obviously, the themes of Shakespeare, and then you could go see Health, Patty Chayefsky. Like there's all sorts of amazing stuff coming up this time. This is why I'm saying to you, Brian, I was really moved that you reached out to me to talk about this film, because it's such a juicy part of. And also, I mean, on a personal level, I was born in August 1971. So films at 50, film writer at 50, basically.
Film writer at 50.
Yes.
So you're watching right now. You're watching films at 50.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter when the movie came out.
Yes, I was born in sync with your podcast as I wanted it to.
That's fantastic. So why do you think it took so long to cast someone as Dirty Harry? They went to so many actors. Have you read about all the people they went to? Like, it's such a great role. Why would so many great actors turn this down? And it's almost like, well, okay, I guess we'll go to Clint. It's like, really?
Isn't that always the case, right? The person who makes the role iconic is always the 5th or 6th choice, or sometimes even more than that. I think because the script, and it was written by a husband and wife team,
right?
Fascinating. Was a hot script, and it was very explosive. I mean, if you were a prominent actor at the time, you were being advised by agents and managers, talent handlers, to not run roughshod over the current ideas of the time. Even if you didn't like hippies, even if you didn't resonate with the left wing and the counterculture, you were strongly advised to sort of to be aware of what was going on. And so there were celebrities like John Wayne and George C. Scott. I think that George C. Scott was one of the people who was who might have been approached for this,
He was approached, yeah.
but who are definite right wingers and who thought, maybe that this script goes too far, maybe this cop goes too far, and also I think the role was conceived for someone a little older at first. It was conceived for someone who was, I think, in their 50s,
right?
And Clint is definitely not in his 50s at this point. And so they went through a list of people. I think that there were some people who probably read it and were like, ew, like, wow, like that's how it ends, what really? And obviously High Noon is a revered movie. Like the idea of a sheriff throwing his badge in the dirt and rejecting a system, that's a line in the sand. And I think that if you were working in Hollywood at the time and you were a star, you might not want to make that political comment. I mean, I think ultimately,
right,
and this is a very Jonathan Rosenbaum idea, but ultimately every film is political. Every film functions in a political space, even if it wasn't intended. And we can say, oh yeah, Dirty Harry is a fun action movie and and a violent one for the time, but it also, I think, first and foremost, is a statement about policing, and it's a statement about the work, the municipal work of being the custodians of a city. That's hard. That's a hard subject to make a film about in an intelligent way. That's also working as entertainment. And so I don't know, if I was an actor and I got the script, I'd consider it very carefully. And I also think that we should look in retrospect. Clint Eastwood, after making this film, becomes Dirty Harry for what were there, 5 sequels?
Four. So there's 5 films total over 17 years. Yeah.
Well, I think that there is something to be said that it might have been a Faustian bargain to some degree for Clint. Yes, he is also becoming a director, and yes, he's making the movies with the orangutan and trying different movies. But he is always going to be thought of as Dirty Harry for a long time in his career, until he starts to become the auteur behind movies like Million Dollar Baby and Unforgiven. And that will require a pivot. It will require us to think of him differently. So Dirty Harry definitely marked him. Some might even say stereotyped him as a sort of this new breed of action star. But
yeah, Magnum Force would come out in 73 and The Enforcer 76. So in 5 years he's in 3 of them. So I think that makes it for audiences, they're like, okay, this is who Clint Eastwood is. And it's not until he starts directing more and more films, doing interesting work in the 80s like Bird, and then finally 21 years after Dirty Harry, we finally get Unforgiven. And that's, I think, the movie that really pushes his career forward in a way that he had been wanting for many years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So originally, at least attached to the film was Frank Sinatra. Can you see Frank in this one? Can you imagine? Can you imagine if it was done exactly the same way by Don Siegel, but it's not Clint, it's Frank?
I mean, that's so crazy. That would be like, that's like watching The Killers and you see Ronald Reagan with the gun, or slapping around Andy Dixon, and it's kind of like these actors, they take these roles, they have no idea how they're going to go on. But yeah, no, Frank Sinatra is another example of an actor who really wanted to broaden his public persona, and was obviously, as he was escaping the Rat Pack and the sort of Ocean's 11 vibe that he had. And when he did movies like Manchurian Candidate, he broadened out his appeal. I think Sinatra's a fascinating comparison with Eastwood, in the sense that both of them are much more political. I mean, in Sinatra's case, he's somebody who was very friendly and affiliated with Kennedy, and he had a strong, robust life outside of movies that was engaged socially and politically. And he also is somebody who is a little typecast and wants to pivot a little. I don't think, I mean, obviously we can't even imagine what a Frank Sinatra Dirty Harry movie would be like, but I know that he does judo in Manchurian Candidate, and I watch it and I think that's bizarre. It's crazy. It's Frank Sinatra. That doesn't make any sense. But I'm glad that it eventually came to Clint, because I'll tell you something that's weird about this. I recently returned to the film. I don't know, the dozens of times I've watched it at this point in my life, but there's something about Clint and his face that's very blank in this film. It's almost like when you watch Halloween and you see Michael Myers in that mask. And
Yes.
it's obviously Clint Eastwood is a good actor and he can act, but his performance is very stoic. It's very blank. And I think that
That's a good point.
I think we need that in order
Mhm.
for this film to function correctly. We need an anti-hero who
Mhm.
we potentially identify with sometimes, and maybe sometimes he'll be like a mirror in which we see ourselves. We've all felt the impulse to go too far
Mhm.
sometimes, and then also someone who is not us, who is
Mhm.
not a mirror and just an opaque wall that we're seeing. And so if it were Frank Sinatra, you would have far too many associations,
Yeah.
right? It would be funnier than it should have been. It would have been Frank Sinatra would have recorded a theme song almost inevitably. That would have been wrong tone for this. And let's just give a shout out right now to Yayo Schifrin's score for Dirty Harry, which I
Oh
think is
yeah.
so extraordinary and very much
Mhm.
in that kind of Ennio Morricone mold,
Mm.
very unusual. But the fact that it's Clint and the fact that he has kind of a blankness, and
Mhm.
he's been on the scene, I don't know, for like 10 years at this point, a little more than that. But he's certainly not established like someone like Frank is. I think that
Mhm.
helps the role. It
Yeah.
helps us enter into, and it doesn't work as an anti-hero unless we can enter into it. So it helps us engage with the material a little better that it's not a star.
I love that you compared this to Halloween. That's fantastic. I mean, I'm thinking of that scene at the end when he's on that bridge and he's just like staring down and
Yep.
he just comes out of nowhere. That is
Yeah.
totally a Michael Myers moment in some way.
It's a Michael Myers moment, and I feel like you have to imagine like a loose cannon just wandering around San Francisco with this gigantic gun, and just almost like a machine, soulless. If you're talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator,
Mhm.
that performance, that whole concept comes out of Dirty Harry. The idea of this sort of almost like a robot policing,
Mm.
like
Mhm.
RoboCop, and it's RoboCop's another movie that gets inspired by this. So
Mhm.
if it was Ring a Ding Ding, like it was Frank Sinatra or any of the
Yeah, he
stars,
would have been waving his finger at the end.
it wouldn't have worked the same way. It wouldn't have worked the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So you talked about San Francisco a little bit. Like, why do you think this film needs to be set in San Francisco? Why can't it be LA or New York? Why is it San Francisco?
It could be. I mean, I feel like San Francisco obviously there's a lot of drama in that city.
Mhm.
Drama, and there's a lot of um obviously there's a lot of verticality in a place like San Francisco. It's an exciting place to set a noir or a
Mhm.
police film. There's a tradition of that I guess you would say
Mhm.
goes back to movies like Vertigo. But I also feel like San Francisco, like we were saying before, it's a site of civil unrest at this
Mm.
point. It's
Mhm.
if you think about Haight Ashbury and you think about what San Francisco represents in the counterculture in the '60s, this is a place where people are feeling abused by cops,
Mm.
and cops are feeling abused by hippies, and it's a place of tension. It kind of reminds me of how the way, to speak of another Don Siegel film, how Invasion of the Body Snatchers was remade in the late '70s as well.
Oh, right. Mhm.
That's a Don Siegel film from the
From the
'50s,
50s. Mhm.
right? But to reposition that in the '70s is sort of like Dirty Harry in a sense, where you have, um, all of a sudden the '70s in San Francisco was a place where you had self-help gurus and you
Mhm.
had people, doing pop psychology, and you had est, and you had former hippies who were trying to find livings as health inspectors. And it's a perfect place for an alien invasion to happen, where it's where people can say, that's not my husband, he's turned into a Republican, he's turned into, and in fact there are lines like that where Leonard Nimoy says things to that effect, like maybe he's become gay, maybe he's become a Republican, maybe there's all sorts of. San Francisco becomes a place. It's the cutting edge of the American experiment in the
Mhm.
'60s and '70s, and so it's an explosive place to put a movie about police brutality.
Mm. Yeah. I just think it's
And
used so well in this. I think one of my favorite things about the movie is the location of San Francisco. All the different locations they use. I wrote down at some point. It's like, oh, it's almost kind of like Hitchcock, the way Hitchcock would like script his movies around. I want to use the Mount Rushmore and find me a way. I mean, there's like that stadium and that quarry at the end, and that that town center at the beginning, that iconic scene where he has the famous line, like the locations inside of San Francisco are used really well here.
Absolutely, and I do feel like a movie like Bullet as well, that you get a sense of these are the movies that San Franciscoans really love. Like they show off the city best, and you see all the different kinds of parts of it, and it's not just that shot of Coit Tower or Alcatraz or whatever. Like you really get a sense of what San Francisco means to people and all the different kinds of neighborhoods. And Clint does a lot of running around in this film to different phone booths, and like, right, you get a sense of what San Francisco is at night, and that amazing opening sequence with the scope, and you're up in the tower, and this whole
it's
idea of seeing
terrifying.
the city. Totally terrifying. My favorite shot in this film, and this is the shot that I think crystallizes so much of what this film is about, is when when Clint Eastwood and Andy Robinson are in the stadium, like you were talking about. It's nighttime, and Andy he's running into the stadium, and this is where the NFL games are happening. This is a big stadium at the time, but there's obviously no one there. They turn on the lights. There's this beautiful music here by Yayo Schifrin, and then Clint says stop, and then he shoots Scorpio in the leg, falls down, and it comes right over to him, and it's like, that's the showdown we're waiting for. And this is why I think this is my favorite shot in it, because right in that moment is when Andy Robinson, he looks up and he's like, I have rights. I want a lawyer. You're a cop, or you shot me. And he makes his voice go really high, like there's a weird kind of feminization of the villain in this part, and it's stuff that would never make it through now, but obviously, but it's and he's the I have a rights, and it cuts to Clint Eastwood, and he steps on the wound on his leg. He doesn't give a shit. He doesn't care about his rights. And in a year long before drones were even conceived of or built, you have this incredible shot where this is a helicopter shot with the zoom cranked all the way in on Andy Robinson's face, and it goes high up over the stadium through the fog that's gonna obfuscate justice and law and order in the proper way that police are supposed to handle suspects. And then we go into it, and it's this sad kind of horns on Yao Schifrin's score that are like, it's like that. That is, I think, one of the most epic moments of 1970s cinema. It's because it's like you have this incredibly explosive confrontation, you have lines being crossed, and then you have this beautiful camera move that has to be conceived with a helicopter, because there's no other way to do it at that time.
Oh yeah.
Nowadays you could pilot a drone or something, and very expensive filmmaking, but also very smart filmmaking.
It kind of makes me think of the last shot of the movie too, which I don't believe was a helicopter. I think it was just zooming out, but like that's something that Don Siegel does a few times in this movie. He really gives you a sense of place, and the opening when we're seeing the girl, the young woman swimming, and she's like at the very, very top of this building, but then we go above her to see someone even higher. Like he uses space really well in this movie, Don Siegel.
Yeah, and I feel like it's space that we are kind of penetrating in a transgressive way. That's what a zoom is for me. A zoom is obviously a very artificial effect. This isn't like a track in, and it's not like a helicopter either. It's an artificiality of the sight of our sight zooming in, and a power that I think some naughty people wish they had. This is the essence of what Hitchcock worked with as well. It's the idea of the peeping Tom, and it's the idea of, we're going to zoom right in on that girl, and we're going to see her. And John Siegel is obviously smart enough to realize, like, when he's using a zoom, he is implying something prurient. He's implying, that some advantage is being taken here that shouldn't be taken. And I feel like whenever I see a zoom in a film, it's almost like a tip off, like something bad's about to happen. And I think also about the mysteries that were happening at the time in terms of really stylish cinema. In Italy, you had Giallo films and Dario Argento right around the same time as this. In 1970, is like a movie like the Cat and the Nine Tails, and you had all these amazing stylish giallos with similar music and similar vigilante cops, and so I feel like Don Siegel is doing if not a response, because I don't know what his familiarity was with Italian cinema at the time, but he's part of that conversation. He's part of the conversation of the stylish police film from the early 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think Don Siegel shot so much of this movie at night? I wrote down in my notes twice. I'm like, man, a lot of this is at night. It's kind of interesting that because I mean, he's not really giving a great sense of the city when it's pitch black out, but we have scene after scene. Like, why do you think he chose? Do you think it adds tension? Is that why there's a lot of night photography?
I think that that's a really fascinating question. I never thought about that. I have to answer. I'm just my initial response is that if this whole film took place in the daytime, it would be unbearable. It would just be too unbearable.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, it's hard enough that in the middle of daytime in downtown, he's going up to someone and pointing a magnum in their face and saying, "Do you feel lucky?" And there's a fire hydrant exploded behind him,
Yeah,
and there's people running and screaming, and it's like it's the middle of a workday, and it's
yeah.
like and the chaos that he creates during a workday. That's a kind of scene that has to happen during the daytime
Right.
in order for the emotional effect to come through. This idea of like he does not give a care about what time of day it is and what
Yeah.
his role is supposed to be, and he hasn't read the book and he's thrown the book out the window. And so I think that if the whole film took place in the hard light of day, it would be almost too unbearable.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, just realistically speaking, if you're talking about this is a movie that was very much inspired by the real life Zodiac killer and the real life Zodiac case. And so, I mean, that's why the character is named the Scorpio Killer. And this is also, so it's basically real life being turned into art, and that was something that was happening at night. These were murders that were happening in the middle of the night. It was a very scary place. And so part of it is trying to create a sort of verisimilitude to what everyone who was living in the Bay Area was experiencing at the time.
Yeah. So why do you think that you just mentioned that scene, that iconic scene where he says, "Do you feel lucky?" Why is that the scene we all remember and love? What's going on there that makes it so famous?
Yeah. Well, I mean, well, first of all, it's the real squinty Clinty, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, Clint has such such an iconic way with a line that, so it's the voice, and it's like, well, do you feel lucky? Like and he's just staring right into the lens, and that kind of, he doesn't have a lot of dialogue in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He doesn't have a lot of quotable lines in that as Blondie, and as iconic as he became in the spaghetti westerns, they were largely silent performances, right? And so I feel like this is the essence of Clint's iconography as an actor. Is like it's the way he's making his voice sound. It's the way it's an unblinking performance. Again, Michael Myers. It's sort of like that weird, creepy, like Gene Wilder in Willy Wonka, where there's not a single blink in the entire performance, and every time it's just this dead-eyed kind of like, oh no, don't go in there. It's like
Yeah.
that spookiness was definitely a hot thing in 1971. That was another 1971 movie, but it's like, so I think that also there's just something badass about the way he's calling a suspect a punk, like he's
Yeah.
like, well, do you feel lucky? And also it's the code of Harry Callahan, let me say that again. It's the code of Harry Callahan, that scene, the idea of ultimately, if you break the law, you are putting yourself in the hands of a cop who is either going to follow the rules or not follow the rules, right? And so you have to ask yourself if you feel lucky. That is the subtitle of this film. Do you feel lucky enough to trust the police in a way with your life? And these people who are patrolling, do they know the rules? Do they care to follow the rules? Do they? Or are they just going to shoot you point blank in the face? And this is something that's very timely right now. I mean, there's a reason why Dirty Harry continues to be provocative to this day. It's because, and we see it over and over again, it's infuriating, it's maddening, it's nauseating, the idea of police who feel like they're above and beyond the law. This is also right now we're having, police that are resigning en masse because of vaccine mandates and everything. They think they're above the law. And it's part of the cop code. And I say that with great love and respect for police. I even have family members in law enforcement, so I understand this. But I also know that Dirty Harry is speaking to that in a way that doesn't normally get spoken to in most police movies, at least up to that point. So that scene is the condensation of it. Do you feel lucky? Do you, punk? Like there is no compassion there. No compassion there.
Yeah. I also love the detail of him chewing on the hot dog for what, a minute and a half as he's shooting, and then he stops shooting and he's still chewing. Like, I'm like, was that Eastwood? Was that in the script? Was that Siegel?
I know that part of this character was based on this very fascinating, flamboyant, real life detective named Dave Toschi, who is also the real life model for Bullitt, Steve McQueen. And he was a detective and he was on the Zodiac case, and Mark Ruffalo plays him in Zodiac. Okay. And he, Dave Toschi was a detective. He wore suspenders. He wore his holster in a certain way. He had, he ate animal crackers. He had he was almost like a real life movie character. And he was a bit of a fastidious man, but also an excellent detective. And so I feel like it doesn't add immeasurably to Harry Callahan as a character, the fact that he could almost kill somebody, but also be eating a hot dog because he doesn't care, and in subsequent movies, right, we see him with hot dogs with ketchup on it. That's an additional insult. Okay, as somebody who loves hot dogs, if you're eating a hot dog with ketchup on it, it means you have no taste. I'm sorry to say it. It means you're a little boy. You should have graduated at this point. Sauerkraut or mustard, certainly not ketchup. And it kind of codes the character as somebody who he is unthinking to some degree. To some degree, he is immature and a loose cannon, and not, I don't know, these cops, like they eat crappy food, they drink black coffee constantly, they're over caffeinated, they're underpaid, the mayor sells them out, and it's the guy from Animal House, it's like the commissioner sells them out, it's like, like they don't the people hate them, the civilians hate them, their boss hates them. So it just adds to the density of this character description. I love that he's chewing in that scene.
Yeah. Some other things I like about this movie and this character, I really love that the movie does not force a romantic subplot into the story. There's not like a woman that's like he's seeing on the side for a few scenes. I like that it's kind of similar, again, to French Connection. His life is his job. That's what he does. And I like that the movie, I mean, what is the movie about? An hour and 42 minutes, something around there. I like that Siegel didn't make it go 2 hours plus by putting in too many subplots that are unnecessary. I like that about it too.
I love that about that. There is a minimalist aesthetic to it. And Clint Eastwood will become guilty of this when he starts putting Sandra Locke in those films and, making room for the extra material that Dirty Harry doesn't need. Dirty Harry is a very clean idea in the sense, like it is, it's almost geometrical in its in the way it's built. I like the fact that its edges are really smooth and crisp, and the fact that it's a movie about a trajectory between an anti-hero and a villain, and the less material that we get in the way of that, the better.
Right.
It makes it feel like a real brutally efficient genre film. And so you can be sure that if you are a young John Carpenter in your 20s in film school and you're watching Dirty Harry, you're like, I need to learn how this film was made. I need to understand, right? I need to understand how And maybe I disagree with it politically, but I need to understand how something this pure and this clean
Mm.
gets made and gets funded
Yeah.
lavishly by the
Hmm.
studios, you know. So
Yeah. Do you think Carpenter watched Dirty Harry before he made Assault on Precinct 13?
undoubtedly,
Probably, right?
I'm certain. I'm certain of it. I mean, I've never heard that from him, but I'm sure he has. And I'm sure that, and Carpenter has on record often talking about how he wanted to make westerns, you know,
Mm.
and westerns were really his jam. And when he was married, he had Ennio Morricone's music for Once Upon a Time in the West playing, you know, during the
Hmm.
ceremony. This is somebody who loves Sergio Leone. You watch something like Escape from New York, it is a Sergio Leone
Yep.
film.
Hmm.
He's casting Lee Van Cleef. He is as big a Clint film, and he's coaching Kurt Russell to basically play Clint Eastwood
Yeah,
in Escape
exactly.
from New York. So right, exactly. So that's basically a Clint movie. That's basically a Sergio Leone movie set in the future in New York. So, and that's one of the reasons why I love it so much. But that's, yeah, Carpenter is profoundly influenced in a formal way by Dirty Harry.
Hmm. The other thing I really love about the Dirty Harry character is that he's not superhuman. Like there's a scene later in the movie where he's getting his ass kicked and he's bleeding, he's like on the ground, he's flailing everywhere. He's not Stallone or Schwarzenegger in this. I like that too. He's not superhuman.
Yeah, he's not superhuman, and I think that that's a good distinction. Even though the face makes him like blank to some degree, like we were
Hmm.
talking about before,
Yeah.
he is not all powerful. You know, he
Hmm.
is. You're right. He is. And but what makes him transcend? I guess maybe that's a loaded word. What makes him powerful ultimately is the fact that he will go where other police won't go.
Hmm.
Right? I mean,
Right.
he will take the power into his own hands. We all know that the Scorpio killer is guilty. We've
Hmm.
seen it. This is not a movie that makes it, that shades. Andy
Right.
Robinson is cast to play a very squirmy antagonist in this. We know that this guy's a bad guy.
Hmm.
So we don't, I don't think that we weep too much when Clint Eastwood goes rogue at the end.
Yeah.
But that in of itself is part of the power of this film, because it weds us to the thinking of a vigilante
Hmm.
cop. It
Yeah.
makes us appreciate and perhaps even agree with that tactic, which is 100% illegal. 100% illegal.
Yeah.
Okay, like let's be realistic about that. Like I don't, you know, it doesn't matter even if you find someone who has committed murder, unless you are under immediate threat of being killed yourself. You can't go around killing people. Like
Hmm.
that's the Miranda laws. That's what's being discussed in the
Hmm.
70s, and that's what we're in trouble with now with all of this police brutality we're seeing in the last 20 years. But
Hmm.
that's what this film is engaging with. But what's powerful about Dirty Harry is that it has the temerity to suggest maybe the cop's sometimes right. You
Hmm.
know,
Yeah.
that's and we're gonna have to go to our own, you know, we have to come to our own reckoning with the power of Dirty Harry. You have to
Mm.
think about it on your own. You have to say, does he go too far? Does he not go far enough? I mean, and why is he throwing his badge away at the end? He should be
Mm.
promoted. Some people will probably be like, this guy is the only guy who understands what policing is supposed to be. Some people would be like, this guy should go to jail. You know, I mean, that's that. I mean, it's just incendiary. This movie. There's so much content in it. There's so much to, and that's. I think I know that this is something you wanted me to reflect on as well. But the movie that it reminds me of in a modern context
Mhm.
is, and we mentioned it before, but Zodiac, obviously.
Zodiac
Zodiac
was my
has a
pick. Yeah.
scene in it where, yeah, right, and right, Zodiac has a scene where they are watching Dirty Harry. So that is happening at the same time as the Zodiac
Oh my
killings,
gosh, I forgot
and
that
and so
they're
you
watching. That's interesting.
they are watching Dirty Harry, and there's even clips, and I think there is maybe one or two clips of Dirty Harry, and Dave Toschi is in that audience, and he is seeing his real work that he's trying to do to catch the Zodiac killer be turned into sensationalistic art.
Mm.
He's seeing his detecting style and his wardrobe being turned into Clint Eastwood. He and he's watching a happy ending essentially unfurl, where everyone knows the Zodiac killer is a murderer, but they haven't caught the Zodiac killer, whereas the Scorpio killer will be caught. He will be apprehended. And Toschi, at least in the script that William Vanderbilt writes for Zodiac, and David Fincher has a hand in this as well, he's confronted by it. Dave Toschi is played by Mark Ruffalo. He's confronted a couple of times in Zodiac by people who are like, "Hey, are you going to catch him, Bullet?" Like, I know that Robert Downey Jr. says that to him. He calls him Bullet at one point, and then
right.
he's in the lobby of Dirty Harry, and I think he's made to feel very unsettled by the movie, because the movie is a fantasy of what I think many wished to happen. Like, it's the fantasy of catharsis. If only we could catch the Zodiac killer, and the Zodiac killer was just some doofus Andy Robinson, he's the Scorpio killer, and we had cops who were empowered and just took care of the situation. But as we well know from real life, and also from Zodiac, Fincher's movie, I think, is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
There was all sorts of red tape and bureaucracy and faxing and departments out of communication. And that's the reason why Dirty Harry doesn't happen in real life, is because there's all sorts of processes that have to happen legally to catch someone and to convict someone. And you can't it can't be hearsay. And there's all sorts of evidentiary requirements that have to happen. And so Dirty Harry is the fantasy version of capturing the Zodiac, and that makes the real Dave Toschi uncomfortable, and we see that dramatized in Zodiac. I think that's fascinating.
That's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned Andy Robinson. Why do you think his portrayal as the villain is so powerful? Like, what does he bring to this that makes the movie better?
Well, there's a lot of things. He's baby faced, right?
Yeah.
There's something that's very kind of cute about him.
Yeah.
And at the same time, sick. He's soft. I think that's part of it, is that he does not look like some ex-con. He looks like some spoiled kid. Another thing that I think Robinson does, especially in that scene that I talked about before in the football stadium, he feminizes his performance. And I think that, and again, I do not want it to be unclear. I'm not saying that I think it's feminine. I'm saying that I think Don Siegel and Andy Robinson are steering it in a way intentionally to make him sound like a hysterical, screaming, shrieking person who's not in control of himself. And he says, "I want a lawyer." And when he screams, it's not like the scream of like a bad guy. It's not like Alan Rickman in Die Hard with that purring voice, like some Bond villain or something. This is the squealing pig of a villain. This is and there's all sorts of associations that they're, and very famously, it's been reported that when that Andy Robinson ad-libbed that line about the gun, right? When Clint Eastwood pulls the gun out, he says, "Oh, that's a big one." So they're also coding him as homosexual.
Right.
There are all sorts of things that are uncool, especially in today's age, that would never happen. Although you watch a movie like In the Line of Fire, and it has that amazing moment when Malkovich, the gun is being pointed at him, and he like fillets the gun, right? He puts the gun in his mouth, Clint Eastwood's, which is basically the literalization of Dirty Harry.
Yeah.
Right? And so Malkovich is coding himself in that moment. I think that might have also been an improv, but like coding himself in that way as well. And it's, obviously it's incredibly provocative to do that. But Dirty Harry is the beginning of that, and I think that Andy Robinson is making a very complex portrayal of villainy here. One that I think probably wouldn't pass muster in today's sensitivities. I don't think that
it's such a unique portrayal. I read that they offered it to James Caan. That would have been a different film. I think he would have been solid in it. I just think there's something more unusual about Robinson that makes the character more interesting.
Robinson he's really embracing the kind of skeezy side of the Scorpio. And you watch Caan in The Godfather, say, which is just a year after this.
Yeah, just a few months, March,
right? And he's just so likable in that film. He's such with the chest hair and the beard and all the things that we love about Sonny Corleone in that film that makes him so older brother and warm, and it's one of the deaths in cinema that I heard at the most when I watched The Godfather, is when Sonny gets shot down on the causeway. It's so because he's such a likable character, and we even understand how he's not as strong of a boss as Michael would become, in that movie. But it's, I mean, I can't imagine anyone else but Andy Robinson playing that. And if James Caan had played that, you can bet that he wouldn't be hanging out at the Playboy Mansion through most of the 70s. His career would have had a completely different trajectory, right? I mean, he would have been our cartoonish bad guy in
he had a busy few months. He was in Brian's Song in November of 71, and then Godfather in March of 72. So yeah, I think he had enough on his plate at this time.
He had enough on his plate, and I love the way Caan's career grows in the 70s. I know that he is another Eastwood-like actor, someone who's smarter than people think. He's not a thug, and and even when he makes movies like Rollerball, and I'm thinking of that movie, what is it, the Michael Mann movie,
Thief.
Thief, exactly. I said Drive, but Thief.
It's like Drive.
It's like Drive, right? But Caan has a fascinating trajectory as well. Thief and Michael Mann in general, that kind of minimalist action movie, again, 100% influenced by Dirty Harry. Michael Mann is a super stylish director who obviously denatures his films and sucks all the sort of browns out of it and turns it into a sleek, minimalist cop film. You talk about something like Heat. You talk about something like even Miami Vice, to an extent, as stylish as that is. These are movies and TV shows that are very indebted to Dirty Harry and the idea of this sort of, let's detach our drama completely from morality. Let's not have our film or our TV show be about, oh, is that good? Is that bad? No, let's have the audience. Let's put that decision on the audience, and that's what Dirty Harry is.
Yeah. Is there anything in Dirty Harry you don't like? Any criticism about the movie? Any scenes or moments you don't think work? I have a couple things.
Question. I would love to hear what isn't working for you.
Oh, so they're very nitpicky things. I think like they refer to him as Dirty Harry like one too many times. I think the third time he's referenced as dirty, I was like, I don't know if that would fly in screenwriting class. It just felt like it felt like a written thing. I also I'm not super on board with the planting and payoff of the punk line, and then we hear it again almost verbatim right before he kills the Scorpio killer at the end. That felt a little too written. I mean, it works. I'm sure it got a lot of audiences clapping, but it feels a little too written. It doesn't feel very realistic. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. But I also feel like that's part of, it's a very schematic script, right? I mean, it has a symmetry built into it, and it's very on the nose. I think you're 100% right about that. But I do think that it's necessary that we see in the beginning of the film a cop who sort of falls on the a victim who falls on the lucky side, and then at the end someone who falls on the unlucky side, right? I think it's important that we see those, and the idea that it is just a sort of a coin toss, that it is just sort of the whims of the day and what he's going through, and it's almost like the off-cited example of Chekhov's gun, right? Where the gun in the first act, it's got to go off by the end of the third act. And I feel like if you're setting up, and that's basically what Harry Callahan is. He's a gun. He's a walking gun. He's a walking magnum, a magnum that obscures almost his entire face because it's so large in the frame. And that gun's got to go off at the end, right? It's Chekhov, it's like, you introduce a character like that in the first 5-10 minutes of your film, we got to see him abuse that power by the end of it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think the movie needs it, but at the same time, I recognize that it's kind of a screenwriting trick. So it's hard to kind of balance that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
and I think that there might have been a more elegant way to do that.
Yeah,
Tom Siegel, he's again like Carpenter, but like a lot of genre filmmakers, he's more interested in getting ideas into the film
Mm,
than, and I think that, than making it super subtle. Obviously,
hmm.
he's a kind of a workman-like filmmaker. If you watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
Yeah.
or even if you go forward and watch something like Escape from Alcatraz, right? You know,
Hmm.
you're talking about a director who's, he's very meat and potatoes. He is building sequences in a very, there's not a lot of frou-frou in this movie. There's
Yeah.
not a lot of style. I mean, you have a gorgeous shot that's well conceived, like that helicopter
Hmm.
shot, the fog, where even the fog is beautifully directed. Obviously, there's no such thing as CGI at this point, but but for the most part, Don Siegel is telling us the story in a very functional, workmanlike way, and I
Hmm.
like that about it because it basically
Mm,
says, I believe in the ideas, I believe in the actors to get them over, and let's just get out of their way. Let's get out of the way of the storytelling and just let people confront these ideas on their own. The more a screenplay tells us what to think, the less engaged we are with
mm,
it. And
right.
so I like how opaque the movie is often.
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe more of a playfulness and energy to like the middle portion of the French Connection. Friedkin maybe adds a little bit
Mhm.
more there, but yeah, I don't think Dirty Harry is a better film if every scene he's Don Siegel's getting super creative with the camera and doing lots of crazy tricks. I think that would take away from the movie. Ultimately, I think we need some of that workman-like structure, as you were talking about.
It needs to be workmanlike. It needs to happen in a realistic San Francisco. That's part of its explosiveness, is the fact that this is a San Francisco that we can recognize. It's kind of the
Mm-hmm.
same idea behind Rosemary's Baby.
Mm,
It's a pretty radical idea, which is like, what if we take a genre movie but put it in Manhattan, modern day Manhattan, with
mm-hmm.
cabs and crazy neighbors and Ruth Gordon, and like all the kind of realness about New York that makes us feel, oh, I'm in the real world. There's solidity here. I understand it. And then it's about Satanists. It's like that. That is what makes the horror work in Rosemary's Baby, and that's what's so brilliant about
Mm,
that film is the fact that no one really thought to take a supernatural thing and wed it to the reality of now. And I think that it's the same thing with Dirty Harry, unless he wanted to make a Western that takes place in this kind of fantasy old west in Spain, shot in Spain, like the Leone movies, right? Like some constructed old west where people could just have showdowns and take each other out, from far away.
mm-hmm.
There was no place to make a story like that happen. There was no place to make Clint Eastwood happen if it wasn't in the Old West. What's provocative about Dirty Harry
Mm-hmm.
is, like, let's take that Old West character, put him in today's modern day streets of San Francisco with all the hippies. What is he going to do then?
Mm-hmm.
And that's also kind of what Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is about, in
Mm,
a large extent, where you have older actors, like the ones played by Leonardo DiCaprio in that film, seeing themselves um, put out to pasture and not getting the roles
right.
that they used to get,
Mm-hmm.
and feeling that kind of resentment, and seeing a new generation come in. And what do you have when that character gets unleashed in the real world? That movie ends in a catharsis of violence for a real reason, and it's not just Manson. It's
Mm,
because it's an echo of Don Siegel. Don Siegel is a huge influence on Tarantino, Dirty Harry
mm,
especially, and it's like the idea of it's the idea of what happens when we take our genre heroes, our amoral, unchecked genre heroes, but put them in realistic situations. What could potentially happen in that
mm-hmm.
space? That's what Dirty Harry is.
Yeah. And so much of it is it's so intense. It's such a great watch just overall. It's just like a really great watch. It gets really violent and scary at the end. Like when he's on that school bus, we haven't talked about that part where he's like in the bus, like screaming at that little kid who starts crying, and this guy means business. We've seen him kill people. So you're really scared for these kids and this bus driver. And when
It's
we
not,
see Clint, it's like, thank God. like we need to do something here.
you're watching the birth of like modern action cinema with that.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, I've read that John Milius had a big impact on the script of
Right.
this.
Hmm.
Milius, he's obviously the co-screenwriter of Apocalypse Now, and
Hmm.
a director in his own right, in movies like Dillinger and the Conan movies. But it's also, Milius has a real kind of a manly screenwriterly streak about him. Like
Hmm.
he's very into very into Herzog and the sort of what am I trying to say about Milius? There's something about Milius that's very masculine, the writing and also the ideas in it. And so I feel like you can tell his influence. I know that he wanted that scene on the bus to be a lot more violent than it was, and
Right.
he wanted the Scorpio killer, I think, to have a flamethrower on the bus or whatever. Like, the idea of little kids on a bus with a flamethrower. I mean, it just was like it had to be scaled.
Might have been too much.
Might have been too much, and I know that Milius himself has admitted that Siegel was a really good influence on his ideas, a scaling back influence. Like this will have a lot more power if it becomes realistic, you know. And so, yeah, that scene on the bus was nightmarish. It's terrifying, you know. And even Fincher has talked in interviews about being a child and growing up in Marion County during the Zodiac killings and hearing about it on the radio. And he didn't. His parents didn't want him to go on the bus. You know,
Oh, geez.
they didn't want him to go on the bus because there was a real unchecked killer on the loose. And so when you have that scene in Dirty Harry, I mean, that's the nightmare fuel for Fincher that leads to Zodiac. There's a direct line in that, and Fincher talks about that. And Zodiac itself starts with that scene of Jake Gyllenhaal bringing his kid to the bus stop. You know, like that little kid is David Fincher, basically.
Such an interesting point. I have not watched Zodiac in a long time, and talking about it again with you right now, I'm like, I kind of want to put it on. Like it's such a great movie. I love Fincher so much. Anything that guy does.
And but it also, I mean, yeah, Zodiac is the kind of film that Zodiac is a great comparison in the sense that Dirty Harry is simplified. All the complexity about the Zodiac killer that was vexing people and still vexes people because it's an unsolved case, really, could be solved by one cop with one gun. That's a massive oversimplification of reality. Zodiac takes that and makes it into real drama and turns the frustration into our entertainment. And for a lot of people, it wasn't successful because it's like, oh, I thought I was watching a movie about the Zodiac killings, and no, I'm watching a movie about cops and paperwork and and Jake Gyllenhaal and Chloe 70. You know, it's like, and then it ends after nearly 3 hours, and you've got credits after credits about the guy was never caught. And I remember being in those audiences for Zodiac and hearing the groans from people, like the lack of catharsis, the pure dissatisfaction about the way that movie ends. It's obviously 100% intended because that's how life is, you know. It's amazing that he used his cash to make that film.
Yeah, and that's how The French Connection ends. We don't get to see what we get at the end of Dirty Harry. We don't get that catharsis, and sometimes audiences push back against that. They were like, "What? No! Kill the guy. We want to feel something at the end." You know.
Yeah, and not to spoil anything on Clockwork Orange, but that ending is the same thing, but in reverse, where you have you know, thank God Alex is back to being a killer. That's basically how Clockwork Orange ends. It's like, thank God his free will is restored to him. Oh, I was cured, all right. And so that, you know, so provocative to have an ending like that. And that's basically the same ending as Dirty Harry in a way. Like, thank God he's able to break the law again.
Yeah. So Dirty Harry, just a great film. You know, one of the very best of 71. It was the 4th highest grossing movie of the year. So even though people were hating on it and it was controversial, people were watching it. Right.
Yep. Yeah. And that's kind of what's cool about the early 70s. I mean, you have mainstream studio filmmaking that is really edgy and also popular. You know, that's great.
Yeah, so it made 36 million off of a $4 million budget. That's probably why we got a sequel 2 years later and then another one pretty soon thereafter. Do you think this movie needed sequels? Could it have just been the one? Like, do you think it's kind of either way, or would you prefer it was just one, or do you like that there's 4 more with Dirty Harry?
I can't really tell you the last time I returned to any of the sequels. It's been years and years.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's just me being honest. Dirty Harry is a movie that I can't turn off whenever I wander off. If it's on TCM or if it's
Right.
I have, and just last week I watched it again for this podcast, but I never get tired of it. But I do know that there is a benefit to having sequels that isn't necessarily about the integrity of the storytelling. It's
Mm-hmm.
not, I don't need to know, I'm not so consumed with plot like younger generations are. I think it's like even you're talking about 10-part shows or like, 3-hour movies, and it's so plotty and knotted and all these
Mm-hmm.
different story developments. I don't really give a shit about Harry Callahan and how he changes over
Yeah.
years. Yeah, I always watch a sequel and I'm like, don't you remember what happened in, Sudden Impact? Or don't you remember what happened in Dirty Harry when you did this? And, it's like, I don't need there to be a continuity there, which is why I didn't, this is a big tangent, but I didn't need the James Bond movies to have a continuity to them either. And
Right. Mm-hmm.
those that have had them over the last several of these Daniel Craig movies, and really was not wondering to myself, oh, what's going to happen with Madeline? What's going to happen?
Yeah.
I go to a James Bond movie and I want to see
A new adventure. Yeah.
a new adventure, and it basically starts from zero. And so there is something significant about the Dirty Harry phenomenon that extends through the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
I like that it exists because you just simply would not have an Unforgiven unless Eastwood had the clout to make it.
Mm. Yeah.
He Unforgiven, meanwhile, it's fascinating, is a screenplay that Eastwood came into contact with in the early 70s after Dirty Harry. And he bought the script. David Webb Peoples wrote it. David Webb Peoples, who would eventually do Blade Runner. And
Mm-hmm.
he said, I'm not old enough to play this character in Unforgiven. So what I'm
Oh,
going
okay.
to do, bought the script, I'm going to pay the screenwriter, and I'm going to hold on to it until I've aged enough where I can direct it myself. And he held on to it for almost 20 years before he made it. And
Wow.
which is a fascinating insight into Eastwood, the idea that even he has the awareness that this gold script, a
Mm-hmm.
screenplay that is probably one of the most perfect screenplays ever made. But even he knows in the moment that he's got to hold it until he has the power enough to make it not have interference from the studio. He can cast the right actors in it. He looks old enough so that it makes sense for a gunslinger who has no code falling into bad habits. So it's interesting to think that that happens around the time of Dirty Harry,
Mm.
but Eastwood has the wherewithal to realize he's not quite ready for it. He's too young for it. This is all by way of saying that I'm glad there are Dirty Harry sequels because
Mm-hmm.
they allowed Clint to make the
Mm-hmm.
real art of his career in the way he needed to make. Because if he had just made Firefox and the monkey movies, right, he
Yeah.
would never have gotten a chance to make Unforgiven.
And The Rookie.
Right, and
Our favorite, The Rookie.
Heartbreak
Yeah.
Kid, it's like,
Just
yeah.
would go on to make so many great films. I think it's really cool that he's 91 and he just had another movie come out, and maybe he has a couple more in him. I mean, that's kind of neat. We're talking about a big actor from 50 years ago who's still actively, appearing in films, directing film.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the fact that the movies that he's appeared in, especially lately, they are not it's not like he's phoning it in. If
Mm-hmm.
you're watching something like The Mule or even, like Cry Macho or what was the last, or Gran Torino is a
Gran
good
Torino.
example too, like where, he's really pushing himself. He's really
Mm-hmm.
acting. Part of it is playing off his iconography, but part of it is just, him, like you say, being kind of ageless in a way. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, so that kind of takes us into our final discussion here, kind of looking at Clint Eastwood's career. We call this segment Beyond the Flick. And like, if you had only three Clint Eastwood movies that you could take to a desert island, like what are the three go-tos? It can be films that he's starred in, films that he's only directed, or both. It's anything that he was kind of affiliated with in his long, God, what is it now, 70-year career? Like, it's crazy.
It's amazing. It really is amazing. I I'm gonna say the first one is The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. I
Okay.
mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think that really is a rare situation where an actor's entire persona gets crystallized
Mm-hmm.
at an early age by one film. And we watched The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and The Man with No Name, Blondie, whatever we want to call that character. So much of what Clint Eastwood becomes, a man of few words, a man of enormous power, a
Mm-hmm.
man unbound by the norms of society, and certainly unbound by, laws. All of that comes into, focus with Sergio Leone in that movie. That's a
Mm-hmm.
movie that, in general, if I had 5 films to take to a desert island, that's a movie that's changed my life. That's, I mean, my entire thesis in college was about it, but also
Oh, wow.
my entire love of cinema, in a way, is rooted in that movie. There's
Mm.
something euphoric about it, something that, almost supernatural about the way it's constructed, metaphysical with the three poles of the characters, and
Mm-hmm.
and I love that film. And the other two Clint Eastwood movies I would pick are the ones that subvert that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that, like, Unforgiven is a great example of that, where Unforgiven is about basically the man with no name retiring and
Mm.
trying to start a family, and he's dealt with a blow and bad luck, in that his wife dies, and he's left with two children, and suddenly, and this all happens before the movie starts, and suddenly he has to step in and make some money and become the person he wasn't before. And throughout Unforgiven, we hear Clint saying, "Oh, I'm not that person anymore. That's not the man I am now. That's not who,"
Mm.
but at the end of Unforgiven, and this is again what makes it so provocative, he is that person.
Mm.
And he is William Money, killer of women and children. He There's that amazing scene at the end of Unforgiven, where he takes out that entire room. He takes out, all these henchmen, and even Gene Hackman's there, and he says, "You better bury my friend right." And it's raining behind, and
Yeah.
there's an American flag behind Clint Eastwood's head in the rain, in the dark. It's a big American
Mm-hmm.
flag, and that's Clint Eastwood saying, "That person that you saw in the late '60s in those Leone films, that was so much fun. This is what that person really is. He's a
Who he
monster.
becomes.
He's a
Yeah.
monster. He can't escape who he really is, and that's America.
Mm.
That's what America is, and that's why there's that flag there." And he says, and then he rides up into the hillside like the angel of death, because he hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
He's still that person that he was. And he fixes the situation. Unforgiven is supposed to leave you with a very, very upset feeling. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
cathartic, but also like Dirty Harry. And I think that third film would be Dirty Harry.
Mm.
Dirty Harry, because it's a further crystallization, but I would say In the Line of Fire too, because
Mm.
In the Line of Fire is basically a revision of Dirty Harry, right? Where you have a Secret Service agent who has made grave mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
that have he needs redemption. He's somebody who did not act when he needed to act, and the president died for it. That character is supposed to be a Secret Service, on the Secret Service detail during the Kennedy assassination. And so the idea of him, um, being a sort of an echo of Dirty Harry who has failed, I think, is a fascinating read on that film. Clint Eastwood's films are like Legos, in the sense that they all connect together. They're interchangeable in some ways. They all build on one another. And the only way you have a career like that is if you keep things really simple. You
Yeah.
got to keep them simple, and you see a through line through them.
Yeah, he's such a great actor and director. I mean, even in his lesser films, it's usually something you can latch onto. And if there's nothing else, watching Clint Eastwood as the lead of a movie, I feel like is always a great way to spend a couple hours. I mean, if I had to pick my three favorites, I would go with Unforgiven and Good, the Bad, and the Ugly as well. And I would put in Million Dollar Baby. I know it's kind of an obvious answer, but I do think that's just such an extraordinary film. Like I remember seeing it. I saw it without having read any reviews. Like I didn't know what it was about. Just that it was getting good reviews, and it was Clint Eastwood's new movie. I went in cold in a way that it's so much harder today to go into a movie cold now. But I remember I did it in '04, and God, where that movie goes in the last half hour, it's just devastating, and it's just such a brilliant film.
It's I love that pick, and that
Hmm.
suddenly makes me want to revise my list too. But I love his I like his performance too in
Hmm.
Million Dollar Baby, and I feel like there is this impulse, for him to be playing a father figure in a lot of his later films that I really enjoy.
Mm.
That's also, something like Gran Torino as well. But I like that side of Clint Eastwood, in the
Hmm.
sense that we see when we see the parents who show up at the hospital, I think after they go to like Disneyland or
Disney World.
something,
Yeah.
world, right? They have all sorts of they don't really care like he cares
Hmm.
about Hillary Swank's character. And
Hmm.
That movie gave Clint Eastwood a way to express his some deeper ideas that we don't often see from him. The ideas of family being more important than politics. I felt that
Mm,
when I watched American Sniper too,
mm,
almost like the old saw about like only Nixon could have opened China. Like, have you heard
mm.
that before? Like only someone who
Right.
is thought of as a real right winger and an anti-communist baiter like Richard Nixon could have gone to China and
Mm,
said, we're going to open this country up. Because people believed that he wouldn't sell out America. It was kind of like he was the only one who could bring the right wing along. And I
mhm,
feel the same thing happens with Clint Eastwood and American Sniper. American Sniper is a
mm.
very critical film about our involvement in Iraq.
Yeah.
And it's but only Clint Eastwood could have shaped it and made it in a way where wouldn't seem like a leftist coastal elite kind of a movie looking down on soldiers. He talks
Yeah.
about soldiers in real pain and conflicted about their work, and snipers, with the power of God, who can see someone from you know thousands of feet away and take them out. And what does that do to a person? How does that change their psychology? How
Mhm.
does that make them feel about their purpose and their duty in the world? Only Clint Eastwood could have addressed those things and not have it seem like like he was being dismissive of it.
Yeah.
He's obviously somebody
Yeah.
who cares deeply about the military.
That's a really powerful film. Letters from Iwo Jima is just a
Yeah.
beautiful
And
film.
Flags of Our Fathers, that's
Flags of Our
the
Fathers.
yeah.
And I have a special place in my heart for, I'm a huge Meryl Streep fan. I think The Bridges of Madison County is a wonderful movie. And I think it's one of Meryl's best performances. And he is really charming in it too.
Absolutely. I think that might have been the first time where I was like, wow, Clint Eastwood really can direct. Like
Oh,
that
yeah.
an amazing drama, a
Mhm.
really beautiful romance. And I would say the same thing about what was it called? The Perfect World, the one with
Oh,
Kevin
yeah.
Costner.
A Perfect World with Kevin Costner. Yeah.
Yeah. That's another example of the way he became a really good director of actors.
Yeah. So it's just kind of amazing to see where his career was in the 60s, early 70s, and to see it evolve over these decades and
Yeah.
not only act in many of these, but also direct so many extraordinary films. What a career.
What a career indeed. I've loved chipping down the films with you, Brian. This
Yeah.
is so fun.
This has been so much fun, Josh, talking Dirty Harry and Clint Eastwood with you. As we wrap up here, if you can tell our listeners where they can find you online and if there's anything you'd like to promote, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, and I hope we can talk one day in the future. It
Yeah.
was really enjoyable. I am. You can find my byline frequently at Entertainment Weekly or EW.com. I'm on Twitter as well at Josh Rothkopf, and you can see me mixing it up online. Please reach out to me. There's nothing that I love more than the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That's what film and film loving is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be someone telling you. It's supposed to be a back and forth. And
Yeah.
so I want to thank you profoundly for
Yeah.
giving me this opportunity. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, that's what makes this podcast such a thrill for me. I mean, this is one of my favorite conversations, Josh. This has been a
Oh,
real
thank
treat to talk to you today. And so thanks for being here. Thanks to
you.
all
I've
of you
missed
for
you.
listening. Thanks to all of you for listening. You can find us online at filmat50.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.